o'clock. Hello everybody and welcome back to Archaeology. My name is Dr. Bill Farley. I'm here from Archaeology 2, participating this weekend in the Real Archaeology gathering, which is pretty exciting if I do say so myself. So working together with several dozen of my favorite and your favorite YouTubers, podcasters, everybody else. So as always, make sure while you're on your way to like and subscribe to this video and to my channel. Check out, there's a whole list of great channels down in my below, and a link out to the webpage for the event in the description, and go check out some of these other videos that are playing this weekend and other folks there. And there's stuff for others too, podcasts and that sort of thing. So I thought I'd really run with this idea of real archaeology a little bit this weekend and try and do something real, right? So a lot of times in this channel, I talk about stuff that I'm interested in, responding to pseudo-archaeology work, or some of my older videos that I would really encourage you to check out on stuff like archaeology and media. But one of the things we're really trying to celebrate here is archaeologists as actual like working scholars and scientists. So I thought what I'd do today was talk about my actual area of expertise, my real, the place where I really do my work, which is in New England, particularly southern New England. And we're gonna really focus in on the state of Connecticut, which is my hometown. It's actually where I'm from. It's where I was born and raised. And then I left for a number of years and came back here for graduate school and then later for work. So I'm very lucky to get to work in my own backyard, and it's something I'm really passionate about, is doing kind of community archaeology, doing collaborative archaeology with Indigenous people in the state. And so what I'm gonna do is give you a somewhat sort of condensed, loose version of just like one of the lectures I give in class, my sort of introduction, absolute baseline level information about the culture history, particularly the pre-colonial culture history of the state of Connecticut and really southern New England a little bit more broadly, and the kind of deep history. People have been living in this region for a very long time, and I thought I'd start with that. So what you can see right from the beginning, we're going with a kind of an old school Milo Rossi mini Minuteman. I taught that guy everything he knows, of course. So he learned this trick from me using the green chalkboard with stuff drawn on it. That's a joke, of course. But Milo, by the way, Mini Minuteman, one of the people participating in this Real Archaeology event. So obviously, if you're watching this video, let's be honest, you're already subscribed to Milo, let's be honest. I got chalk all over me, for Christ's sake. I was out here drawing projectile points on this board for 20 minutes before I started recording. So yeah, if you're subscribed to this video, to my channel, you're already subscribed to Milo. So let's be honest, but obviously check out his videos as well. I'll make a couple of particular suggestions. Check out JT Lewis's videos. He's a really small channel, even smaller than mine, but also a working archaeologist. I would subscribe to his. He really needs that love because his channel's really just getting started off. It's really tiny, but he's a brilliant guy, young archaeologist working in North America. So you're gonna see a lot of topic overlap, I think, between myself and JT if you like what I'm doing. But let's get to it. Let's talk about it a little bit, right? So we got our green board. We got our green board here, our blackboard. I love myself an old blackboard. I had colors and that sort of stuff. So I thought I'd just kind of like run us through this, right? So like a lot of things in North America, and especially in New England, the story here in Connecticut kind of starts, in terms of people's presence here, starts with the end of the Pleistocene. So the Pleistocene, if you don't know, was the last ice age. So we're talking 15, 20-ish thousand years ago. This part of the world where I am now in southern New England was covered in a couple of miles thick of an ice sheet. And this incredibly dense sheet of ice was obviously not habitable to humans, but pretty much as soon as that ice sheet starts to retreat northward at the end of the Pleistocene, as global climate starts to warm much more slowly than it is now, but over the course of hundreds and thousands of years, that climate is going to warm and it's going to get wetter. Those glaciers are going to move northward and start to break apart. The Laurentide ice sheet to the north of us here will start to go away. And with that, by about 12.5 to 13,000 years ago, seemingly, we've got a couple of things happening all at once. One of them is an environment here in Connecticut that is habitable to people for the first time, at least in many tens of thousands of years. The second one is sort of a food source. So we probably have a roving caribou and folks like that kind of moving through the region. And the third is a population pressure of humans. So the humans who had populated all of North America by this point, whether they be pre-Clovis folks or Clovis folks, that's a discussion and debate for another video. They're making a toolkit that is very reminiscent of the Clovis people. But at about 12,500 years, we get our first people in the state of Connecticut. And in fact, the oldest site in the state of Connecticut is in Avon, which is kind of up in this part of the state right here, the kind of northwest part of the state. And it's a 12.4-ish thousand years old. It's called the Brian Jones site. Quite recently excavated, found and excavated just in the last half decade or so. So that's a really new find. We did have Clovis period sites before that at maybe about 12,000 years, but that pushed that date back in Connecticut by a little bit, by a few hundred years. And when you're at that kind of length of time back there, that's a big deal to get pushed back a little bit. Really amazing site with hopefully a lot of research to come on that, because not much of it's been published just yet. But there is a little bit out there. So if you're interested, reach out, let me know, ask me in the comments, and maybe I can kind of send you to where you can learn at least a little bit about that site. Really amazing archaeological site, preserved features and all that sort of stuff. So when we're talking about the Paleo period here in Connecticut, we're really talking about this region's version of Clovis. So the stone tool most iconic of that period is, of course, the Clovis point, or this fluted point, right? So this is a bifacially worked spear point, really large, usually out of really high quality materials. Sometimes they come from far away. Sites here in Connecticut often have stone resources coming from as far away as northern Maine, the border of Canada, all the way down into western Pennsylvania. These really high quality cherts that are very colorful, and people are sort of collecting those up and bringing them through this region, probably following migratory animals like caribou and hunting them, and also smaller game as well, of course, generally having a really highly mobile lifestyle, so not staying in any one place too long. So there aren't a ton of these sites in Connecticut. There are maybe a few dozen known. So this is a period that's understudied just because of a paucity of sites. Though we know the sites are there because, for instance, we find these fluted points in like historical society collections and things like that, which suggests there are probably a lot more sites that we just don't know about yet. And also another thing that I'll note is Long Island Sound, which is the stretch of the Atlantic Ocean to the south of Connecticut. If you bring a map of New England, if maybe you're not from around here, there's a stretch of ocean from south of those New England states and New York that goes across to Long Island, that big long strip island. It's a part of New York State nowadays, but it's actually a glacial terminal moraine. It's the end point of the glaciers. As they got to their furthest point, they basically dump a bunch of trash into the ocean and they start to retreat. And so these big, long, strange islands you can see on the map along this part of North America are all mostly from that. Cape Cod is the same sort of a thing, as well as Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and places like that, Block Island, these sorts of places. They're all parts of terminal moraines. And that stretch of ocean for this first period, 12-ish, 13-ish thousand years ago, would have been exposed. It would have been above water for the same reason that like Beringia is, and I've got other videos that talk about Clovis and pre-Clovis and talking about the opening of the Bering Land Bridge and that sort of thing. In that same way, the Long Island Sound would have actually been above water at that time, or I should say the water was below the surface at that time. Water levels were much lower because of the end of the Ice Age. And it's very likely that there are archaeological sites out there in that underwater area, but they are quite hard to find. Every once in a while, a lobster podocarp, it'll have like a mastodon tooth in it or something, right? So obviously that late Pleistocene, early Holocene environment is out there. Very likely humans are there. If we were ever gonna find a pre-Clovis site in southern New England, there's a decent chance it would be out there in Long Island. So something to kind of keep an eye on is that get your jollies in on your underwater archaeology, and we'll go from there. All right, so the rest of this video is going to be like this. I'm just going to kind of move through time here and give you some real basics and sort of just look at this very, very straightforward, and maybe occasionally I'll have some slides up here or some pictures so you can see what some of these artifacts that I want to kind of give you what in archaeology we call the culture history. So I'll make a note about this. It's actually a little bit of a theoretical point. I'm teaching archaeological theory right now and I love talking about this stuff. But we're going to kind of we're going to do some necessary objectifying of people here. And I say necessary meaning that scientifically this is kind of important to do, but note that this is not something that we do lightly, and it's not something that we do as archaeologists without being thoughtful about it. But when we talk about the culture history of a region, what we usually are talking about is boiling people down to their material culture. So what do we have left in archaeology? When we excavate a site, and that site might be 9,000 years old, 12,000 years old, or even 500 years old, what do we actually find? We find a series of material culture. We find stone tools, we find ceramics, we might find food bits, artifacts. We also find features. So we might find the post molds associated with a house. In New England, for at least the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, the tradition of house building, they're called wigwams or sometimes weetus. And you know, if you Google that, or you might know what that looks like, right? They're kind of highly mobile houses, really resilient. They're around for thousands of years, even into long after contact with Europeans. They stick around really up until there's evidence in the 18th century. In the 19th century, people still building wigwams in some places on reservations. So incredibly resilient cultural form. But, and then we have like at the next scale up some other things. We have like settlement patterns. So those are sort of the sites themselves. Let's say we've got terminal archaic sites, and we might find those in a particular pattern across the landscape. Or late woodland sites, that's the period right before Europeans tend to run along major riverways and near estuaries. Early archaic sites, Gulf of Maine archaic sites in particular, tend to be near marshes and wetlands, right? So we get these kind of settlement patterns. But all of the evidence we have is this sort of derived culture, right? We can't see the people themselves. We can't get into a time machine and go back. There are places we can get some of that information more directly. For instance, we can talk to Indigenous people or work with Indigenous people, or maybe if an archaeologist might be an Indigenous person themselves, and those folks can bring those oral histories and the knowledge of their own deep history, their own deep cultural traditions that might help inform that. But traditionally in archaeology, we're left with this material culture. So when we talk about cultures in the past, when we refer to the Paleo-Indian or the Clovis people or something, like, what does that really mean? Archaeologically, Clovis is not a single culture as we might think of today, like a particular culture or a nationality or an ethnicity or a racial group, any ways that we kind of group people in the nowadays. It's different from that because Clovis is huge. These Clovis sites are found literally over the entire continent of North America. And there's thousands of these sites, and the toolkits look really similar. And that's the key. When we talk about the culture history periods of a region, we're usually referring to a oft repeated pattern of material culture. That is to say, a site. We have an archaeological site, and that site has a grouping of all of the things associated with that culture history, that culture, sort of lowercase c culture, so that might be a particular. I mean, most commonly we're often talking about forms of projectile point, that is to say, spear points or arrowheads, because those are really temporally and spatially tied, meaning that they change through time and they're patterned. We can find sites with a particular shape of projectile point and style of projectile point and made out of a certain kind of stone, and it will repeat again and again and again on sites that then are radiocarbon dated to the same time period over and over and over again, right? So it's a real thing. This is a tradition of making this particular type of stone tool through time and space. That's bounded in time and space, right? It's a little theoretical here, but I want to point that out because as I go through this, as I sort of talk about this, I don't want you to get the impression that I'm suggesting this is the extent of what culture would have been like. People living in any one of these time periods in the deep past would have just been just as complex, just as smart, just as accomplished as any human living today. These are people who are, genetically speaking, barely separated from modern people. There's essentially no difference, right? So we're not talking about people this isn't hundreds of thousands of years ago. We're talking about hominids or something. We're talking about human beings who are fully the same as us, and they could accomplish all the same things as us. They had complex language systems, religious systems, kinship, communal groups. They invented things. They created life. They created culture. They created art. They did all of that stuff, right? But in archaeology, we have to sort of start from our building blocks, which is the actual evidence and data that we have. And that's artifacts, sites, features. These actual material things get left behind. So we group these into these patterns. We call those cultures. We call them, or sometimes traditions or horizons. Sort of depends on the scale we're talking about here. You'll hear archaeologists use different terms. But that's what we're referring to. So when I talk about a paleo culture in Connecticut, or a Clovis culture site in Connecticut, we're talking about one of these patterns of material culture that might look very similar to a site in Texas or Utah or South Dakota, right? That's one of the amazing things about Clovis. Once we get past this Paleo period and into the Archaic and onward, we're going to see a fluorescence. We're going to see a difference emerge, and we're going to see that sites here in Connecticut are going to look distinctive. They're going to become Southern New England sites. They're going to become, and increasingly so as we move forward in time, to the point where as we get to the last few hundred years, we're now talking about the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different tribal or other forms of government. I shouldn't call it tribal, I should just say cultural groups of different sizes, shapes, types, whatever, right? So that's a long intro there to give you a little bit of this background. And that's really important. That's useful information. You can take that info if you're interested in archaeology and bring it anywhere, because that's true of basically how we do archaeology anywhere. Unless we've got a historical record to work with, and even then, archaeologists are still usually going to be thinking this way, because that's the most basic building block of how we can organize the actual data and material culture that we have on archaeological sites. Back to our sort of board here moving forward. And we don't have to get like too sort of into the weeds here, because any one of these we could spend hours talking about these single time periods. And we're also going to be jumping through time quite quickly, because already we're going to go from about 12,500 years ago to about 9,000 years ago. So from 12,500 to about 10,000, those are all still part of this kind of Paleo period, this late Clovis period. We do see a movement away from these fluted points. The flute, by the way, is this sort of distinctive flake at the bottom that's found just on these kinds of points mainly. And as we move forward, we're going to see that fluorescence, that change, that individualization of artifact types for their particular region. So here in Connecticut, the early Archaic period, about 9,000 years ago, and I'll say here, I've boiled this down to a single artifact type for each of these, but a couple of sources. I'll send you along to kind of check this out. One of them is the book I've got right here. This is a book by Boudreau, and it's kind of the Bible projectile point typology for New England. It's a phenomenal book, great pictures, and it can really show you the diversity here at boiling this down quite a lot. The second book I'll suggest, I've got Ivor Hume's book over here, which is about colonial artifacts. So when we get to the kind of post-colonial period, that's our kind of standard artifact guide for that period. But I also want to draw, I went looking for it and I cannot find it. I think one of my students might have borrowed it, which means I'll probably never see it again. But that's okay. If one of you has it and you're watching this, can you just put it back in the bookshelf when you come back. A book by Lucianne Lavin that's about the entire archaeology of Connecticut. Phenomenal book that just goes through the whole history and the deep history of Connecticut, era by era, and talks about all the different archaeological sites, and then eventually when it does get to the point where we've got historic records and we have ethnohistory and we have accounts from native people, it brings that information in for those latter periods. Phenomenal read. So look that up, Lucianne Lavin. I'll have links to all those in the description, as well as some other resources. I'm just going to dump a bunch of cool resources in there for you to check out. Cool books about Connecticut archaeology and New England archaeology, especially in the pre-colonial period. But moving forward into the early Archaic, we have that sort of late Pleistocene period where we have that glacial retreat, and as people are here for a couple of thousand years, we'll see folks sort of start to settle down, still having a lot of long distance travel routes, but a little bit of longer term stays and shorter distance movement through the region. And at that time period, the geology of the region is really changing rapidly, and there are periods when there are sort of inland seas, and what would later become the major riverways of Connecticut are much larger passages, and a lot of human movement into and out of the region. One of the first examples of actually a tradition that we get here in the early Archaic, this period about 9-ish to 10-ish thousand years ago, is called the Gulf of Maine Archaic, which actually comes in from the north. It's got Maine in the name for a reason. So this is a group of people who are moving from the north down into southern New England, and they use a really different and notable, because they use a really different kind of stone tool technology. They don't use very many projectile points. Instead, we've had little quartz microliths, and they might have been used on multi-tools for processing tubers, because these sites are almost always found next to major wetlands, places like cattail and stuff like that. And they also built pit houses into hillsides, like for example, a great example site for this is the site of Sandy Hill, which is on the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation in Connecticut. A lot of the example sites I might mention today probably come from some of the reservations in Connecticut. That's because there's been a tremendous amount of archaeology done there since the 1990s, largely driven by the tribes, actually. So this is some of the federally recognized and state recognized tribes in Connecticut have been some of the biggest supporters of archaeology in the state, and a lot of what we know is actually driven by that indigenous activity in the state, which is pretty cool, frankly. At that same time period, you also have a group coming in from the south that's called the Atlantic Slope tradition. And actually, this point type right here, which is called a bifurcate, is a part of the Atlantic Slope tradition. Bifurcates are particularly distinctive. They're these really interesting points with this deep basal notch, and they just look like nothing else we have in this region. Very unusual, interesting kind of an artifact. People love to, it's a lot of people's favorites from any of these time periods. So those groups are kind of coming in from the south. So we have folks who are sort of staying local, who've probably been here since the Clovis period, as well as populations moving south, populations coming north. And also that's a theme that's going to start to emerge here in this Connecticut region. It's a place that people are kind of moving in and out of. There's a lot of immigration and emigration into this part of the continent, and it's probably population densities were pretty high, especially at certain periods, perhaps in the late Archaic, that compared to lots of other places. When we move into the middle Archaic, which I've got pictured right here, and this is a picture of the shape of a Stark point, which is, again, it's actually my favorite type point from this region. And we're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. And, a lot of continuation of the traditions we saw in the previous time periods, where we're going to see point types change. Settlement patterns are going to stay not that different. Maybe, again, a little bit more sedentary. If we see some patterns emerging here, we're going to see increasing sedentary. People are staying in one place for longer. People are doing less long distance treks up and down the East Coast every year. That's a tradition we're going to see sort of emerge and stick around. But mobility still remains quite high during that time period. Again, we have a lot of cultural traditions moving in and out of the region during that time period. And we have Laurentian traditions coming in from the north, and Susquehanna traditions coming in from the south. So these are again, I'm calling them traditions or sort of cultures. These are really movements of material culture patterns. So we're seeing point types that we call the Susquehannas and the Atlantic Slope moving in, and the groups that were kind of already here seem to transition into what's called a narrow stem tradition. By far the most common pre-contact artifact type in Connecticut on any site you're going to find ever are what are called narrow stem points. And there are these quite small, almost always made of quartz, like 95% of the time made of quartz. And they come in a few different forms, but they're small, usually stemmed, They're shaped a little bit like that. And like, you know, if this is a start point, these are not to scale, of course. You know, a narrow stem point might be half the size. They're really tiny, and they're found everywhere. These are like if somebody walks up to you, if you're an archaeologist working in Connecticut, and somebody walks up to you and you're like, "Oh, I found an arrowhead in my backyard." Like you could like put some money down, put $20 on a table, and say, "I'll bet it's a narrow stem point," and you're gonna get your money back like 7 times out of 10. It's very warm here. I think it's guns o'clock. It's guns o'clock. It's time for guns. So we're gonna take off the jacket. We're gonna get a little comfortable. We're getting comfy and cozy. We're moving into the middle Archaic, moving into the late Archaic. Things are getting exciting. We're talking about narrow stem points. What's more exciting than this? We're talking about some real archaeology today. I'm having a lot of fun. I'm having kind of a lot of fun. Hold on, get my hair fixed. Boop, 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 boop. Guns o'clock. It sure is. It absolutely is. Guns o'clock. I've lost my sort of train of thought a little bit. As we move into the late Archaic and ultimately what's called the terminal Archaic from about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. Again, we're going to see increasing diversity of point types. We're going to continue to see that proliferation of different cultural groups, presumably those cultural groups mapping onto patterns of material culture, but at least different shapes and forms of artifacts are going to start to emerge. And we see a big, kind of important thing emerge during the late Archaic and the terminal Archaic that I didn't draw a picture of, which are steatite bowls. So steatite bowls are a type of stone bowl. They often have these kind of lugs, and they're stone. They're made of stone. They're soapstone, and they're beautifully carved. We find a lot of these in northwestern Connecticut, particularly in this late Archaic period, and they're often kind of interpreted to be a little bit of a lead-in to ceramics, because up until this point, we don't have any ceramics on sites here in Connecticut. And these steatite bowls are really beautiful. They're really interesting. I'm sure I'll have a picture up here for you at some point. But they serve as a sort of a lead-in to the transition into the Woodland Period. So as we move into the Woodland Period, this is our big break, right? We have this first stretch here that's called the Archaic Period, and then we have the Woodland Period. Why do we separate those out? Largely it's because of ceramics. So as we move into the Woodland Period, we are going to see, again, a continuation of changing to points type. This is called a Jack's Reef type right here. This here at the end, in the terminal Archaic, this is called a fishtail type. We have a Jack's Reef and a Lavana point here, which are two very common points in the middle, and the late Woodland, right? But again, somewhere in here, the bow and arrow is introduced to the region. Before that, everything is spears, spear points, and probably atlatl darts in a lot of cases. But at this beginning of the Woodland, we're going to see the introduction to the region, or the independent invention, perhaps, of bows and arrows. So we finally have actual arrowheads instead of spear points. And we also see the introduction of pottery. Pretty late in the game here. In many places in the world, most places in the world will already have pottery at this point, but about 3,000 years ago, we get our first pottery style, which is called vignette. These kind of conical shaped vessels. They're sort of cone shaped. They stick around for about 1,000 years in this region, and they coincide with a big dietary shift in this time as well. During the early Woodland, we're going to see people start to settle down into perhaps year-round villages for the first time, and we see this is a little bit kind of debated scholarship a bit, but there's a lot of debate about the introduction to the region of what's called the Eastern Horticultural Complex. We don't have agriculture, full-blown agriculture yet, people building farms and living near them year-round, but we do see sort of the hints of early domesticates showing up in the region, perhaps people practicing horticulture. So rather than full-blown agricultural practice, people are encouraging certain plants and things like chenopodium, sunflower, sumpweed, and a few other things start to get kicking around in this region. And perhaps that's why people start to use steatite vessels, and then ultimately early vignette pottery. Vignette pottery is really rough, big kind of chunks of inclusions in it, but it is a low-fired kind of a ceramic vessel. So in the Woodland Period, we're going to see a similar proliferation of ceramic styles as we do with point types. Ceramics in New England are more complicated than points. Points behave better. They tend to stay nicely grouped. They tend to move around the landscape and are sort of, again, I mentioned, like temporally and spatially bounded in nice ways. Ceramics act a little bit more complex. Ceramic styles kind of flow more quickly and are more locally regionalized. So whereas a point typology might emerge in Connecticut and just cover the whole state, the ceramics in the New Haven area, which is like where I work on the Quinnipiac River, might look quite different from those along the Thames River, which is like where the Pequot and Mohegan reservations are. And those might look quite different again from those along the Farmington River. We're talking more kind of in the Schaghticoke or Paugussa territory of the state or something like that, right? So there's quite a lot of variety there, but there are a couple of small trends that we can track through time. One of them is a movement into what are called Windsor-style pots. So we go from those conical pots of the Vinette to a rounded bottom pot of the Windsor style, ultimately ending in the late Woodland and into the Colonial period with a huge increase in complexity. We get these sort of Shantok style, often associated with the Mohegan style pots that are kind of like the iconic artifact of New England, native New England, pre-colonial native New England. They're bulbous bottomed round pots like the earlier Windsor traditions, but they have these really elaborate collars and they have medallions on them that might represent maize kernels and fertility references. Really this interesting proliferation of more obvious symbolism. I shouldn't say more symbolism, more obvious symbolism within this kind of material culture type. And that kind of crests right into the contact period with Europeans in the 17th century. I promised many months ago I'd participate in the Real Archaeology thing. I'm very passionate about this, but I didn't have like a video planned, and you'll notice this is the first video I've had in a little while. I've been like going crazy busy. I had a local conference, really successful, had 200 archaeologists, my closest friends here in the state a few weeks ago, which was so exciting. The conference went really well. It was really amazing to have all those real archaeologists here in the state talking about their research, talking about exciting stuff. So I'm sort of embroiled in it at the moment. I haven't had as much time to make videos for you guys, so I'm excited to be kind of forced to do that for you right now. So, but this is just a little bit looser, so hopefully. But you know, we're going back to old school Milo Rossi, like I said before, with the green board behind me and all that sort of stuff. Now, the late Woodland is when things start to get kind of interesting. Well, they've been interesting the whole time. Let's be honest. Come on, you're interested, you're excited, you're having fun with me, right? But in the late Woodland, about 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, is when big changes happen really fast. And that's the period at which agriculture diffuses into the region from the southwest, probably. And by agriculture here, I mean maize agriculture. I'm talking three sisters. We're talking maize, beans, and squash. We start to see those show up on archaeological sites all over the state. About 1,000 years ago, as macrofossils, that is to say like the whole seeds, and some phytolith evidence, microbotanical kind of sciencey stuff. You got to use goggles and like lab coats and stuff for that kind of thing. And that kind of evidence might be showing up in the region as early as about 2,000 years ago. So somewhere in that neighborhood of 2,000 to 1,000 years ago, we're seeing maize agriculture start to emerge, coinciding with these big changes to ceramic vessels and, you know, continued proliferation of different sorts of point types and other artifacts like that. But we also see a shift in people now moving towards settling into villages and year-round settlements. A lot of the stuff we typically see with agriculture. Now, I've done some research myself on this. I'd like to make a whole video on that sometime soon. I did a thread on Twitter about it that was kind of popular, and I shared around again pretty recently, but I wrote a paper with a couple of colleagues a few years ago looking at this time period, that late Woodland, and looking particularly at houses, at that wigwam tradition and how it changed during this time period. It seemed to suggest that things really were in a big and kind of fast state of change at that time. And it would be really, it's an interesting sort of sometimes sad kind of thought experiment to consider what might have occurred had European settler colonialism not occurred shortly thereafter. Talking about the colonial history of Connecticut and the continued presence and resilience of Native people in that colonial history, and also the complex and super interesting presence of the Dutch and the English and other European groups in the region is really actually what I do. That's my actual specialty. That's the period 17th century is my actual expertise, if you will. I want to make some videos specifically about that. So we'll kind of come up right to this point here. But the first evidence of Europeans in Connecticut is around 1619, 1620, 1621. It's actually the Dutch. The Dutch were here before the English. There were Dutch trading posts in Connecticut, and they started a pretty intensive trading with native people, especially along Long Island Sound, particularly the Pequot in eastern Connecticut, and the Pequot became a major political player in the region very quickly because of the wampum trade, and this was a part of the broader fur trade up and down the East Coast and way inland into Iroquois territory and places like that. Pretty quickly, within about 10 years, we see the first English settlements in the region. We see the first major war in the region in the 1630s between the English and the Pequot, and then a later conflict in the 1670s between the English and many native groups of native people around New England, and pretty quickly, by the 1630s, we are also seeing the settlement of what we might recognize as some of the first native reservations in the country, some of them right here in Connecticut. Pequot Reservation and the Mohegan Reservation were founded not long after the Pequot War. The Quinnipiacs had a series of reservations with the Guilford and New Haven colonies as early as the late 1630s, and so that's going to really set the stage for a lot of the history of that colonial period. So I'll just sort of say a few words here at the end. So remember, this is kind of initially a part of this Real Archaeology project, although of course this video is going to be up forever, so maybe you're watching this sometime long in the future. But whether you are or not, make sure you're supporting archaeology science communicators online on whatever platforms you like, whether it be YouTube, TikTok, podcasts, people writing blogs, people writing just like popular literature, folks. These are all folks who are participating in this. I think we have something like 60 creators, including all of the big name people. Your Histories with Kaylee's and your Stefan Milo and your Milo Rossi Mini Mans and your and just all of the big name kind of people who I love to watch, just like I'm guessing you probably do too, as well as a lot of much smaller creators. Believe it or not, in this big crowd, I'm one of the medium-sized creators with my time of recording here, something like 7,000 subscribers. So that makes me medium-sized in this group. There's a lot of smaller creators, and I do think it would be great if you sort of showed some of those folks some love and went and subscribed to their channel. And I'll say a big thank you to the organizers. I helped organize a little, but didn't do as much as I was originally hoping, because it's been, again, it's been a busy couple of months, but especially a big thank you to Flint Dibble, who was the kind of primary driving force for this. So, a bunch of us have been talking about doing this for a couple of years, but he's the guy who made it happen. There's always got to be a guy who makes it happen, right? So, and this time that was Flint. So, hopefully we're going to do this, every year, and we'll make it kind of an annual thing, hopefully. But for now, go check out some of those channels, and if you like this one, subscribe, check out some of the other stuff I do. I do much more. I've had much more formal edited videos besides this one, so please go take a look at those and have yourself a wonderful day. Keep yourself safe, and I'll see you soon.